They didn't leave because you were hard to love. They left because you saw through them. And people who spend their whole lives hiding from themselves will always fear the person who can feel what they refuse to say. You felt it, didn't you? The slow change in their energy before the distance started, the colder texts, the delayed replies, the fake smile while something inside them quietly disconnected from you. And the worst part? You blamed yourself for noticing it. That's what happens to female empaths. You spend years learning how to understand everyone else, while nobody ever learns how to understand you. And tonight, someone finally says the part out loud nobody talks about. Men don't struggle with female empaths because empaths are too emotional. They struggle because female empaths trigger emotional truths they spent years trying to avoid. And once a man realizes you can see through the mask, everything changes. The first harsh truth is this: female empaths make emotionally you. Available men feel emotionally exposed. That is why they pull away, not because they don't feel something, because they feel too much. See, emotionally avoidant men survive through disconnection. That's how they learn to protect themselves. Somewhere in childhood, vulnerability became dangerous. Maybe they were ignored. Maybe they were shamed for expressing pain. Maybe love felt inconsistent, so they adapted. They became emotionally self-contained, detached, controlled, unreadable. The problem is, most people never challenge that survival strategy. Most relationships stay on the surface: physical attraction, routine conversations, temporary chemistry. But then they meet a female empath, and suddenly someone is paying attention to what they never say. That terrifies them. Because empaths don't connect to words first. They connect to energy. They notice emotional tension hidden beneath confidence. They hear sadness underneath sarcasm. They feel anxiety inside silence. And when in a void, Dante man realizes someone can emotionally read him without him speaking, his nervous system panics. At first, he becomes obsessed with you, because your emotional depth feels like home. For the first time in years, he feels emotionally safe, seen, understood, accepted without performance. And that kind of connection becomes addictive to emotionally wounded people. But eventually, the intimacy becomes too real. Now your presence starts forcing him to confront emotions he buried years ago: pain, fear, insecurity, shame, neediness. The very emotions he built his identity trying to suppress. And this is where female empaths get trapped. Because when emotionally unavailable men begin feeling overwhelmed, they retreat. Not always physically, emotionally. And female empaths can feel emotional abandonment instantly, even when nothing is verbally wrong. That's the curse. You notice everything. You notice when affection becomes mechanical. You notice when eye contact changes. You notice when I love you loses emotional weight. You notice when someone's body stays present, but their soul quietly leaves the room. And when you finally ask what's wrong, they tell you, nothing. You're overthinking. You're too sensitive. Numbered. You're emotionally aware. There's a difference. But because empaths naturally self-reflect, you begin doubting yourself instead. You overanalyze your reactions. You apologize for your intuition. You shrink your emotional needs, hoping the connection survives. And this is where the destruction begins. Because female empaths don't abandon relationships first. They abandon themselves first. Little by little, you stop speaking up. Stop asking for reassurance. Stop expressing disappointment. Not because the pain disappeared, because you became afraid your emotions would push them further away. And nobody talks about how psychologically damaging that becomes. Living beside someone emotionally unavailable feels like starving next to food you're not allowed to eat. And they give just enough affection to keep hope alive, but never enough consistency to make you feel safe. That inconsistency traumatizes empaths. Because empaths attach deeply to emotional memories. You remember the vulnerable nights, the soft moments, the deep conversations at 2 a.m. where they finally opened up, and your heart keeps believing. That version of them is the real one. But emotionally unavailable people often weaponize vulnerability without realizing it. They open emotionally in moments of loneliness, then disappear once closeness becomes uncomfortable again. And the empath stays behind emotionally wrecked, trying to understand what changed. Nothing changed. You simply saw the conflict inside them before they were ready to face it themselves. That's why female empaths attract wounded men so often, because wounded people feel emotionally safe around with loyalty, depth, presence, patience. They don't offer fragments, they offer their soul. And when that love is mishandled repeatedly, the empath slowly begins disappearing emotionally. You can see it in her eyes, the exhaustion, the confusion, the silent grief of constantly understanding others while feeling emotionally unseen herself. That's why some female empaths isolate. Not because they hate people, because emotional disappointment became unbearable. And the deepest pain? Nobody notices how destroyed the empath is until she finally stops giving. Because everyone became addicted to her emotional labor, her softness, her forgiveness, her emotional availability. But nobody asks who carries the empath when she collapses internally. Nobody asks how exhausting it feels to constantly absorb everyone else's pain while hiding your own. And eventually, the empath reaches a breaking point, not example. Plosive, quiet, dangerously quiet. One day she simply realizes, I cannot keep begging for emotional safety from people committed to emotional avoidance. And once that realization happens, she changes forever. The second harsh truth is this. Men who need control cannot handle female empaths because empaths eventually see through manipulation. That's what terrifies toxic people most. Not your emotions, your intuition. See, manipulators survive through confusion. If they can make you question your instincts, they control reality. That's why toxic relationships feel psychologically exhausting. Nothing is stable. One day they love you intensely. The next day they become distant. One day you're their peace. The next day you're too much. That emotional instability is intentional more often than people realize, because inconsistency creates emotional dependency. Your nervous system becomes addicted to chasing emotional reassurance. And female empaths are especially vulnerable to this because, see, they naturally search for emotional resolution. You don't want control, you want clarity. But toxic people weaponize ambiguity. They leave conversations unfinished. They avoid accountability. They rewrite history. They deny obvious emotional shifts. And over time, the empath begins disconnecting from her own intuition. That's the real damage of manipulation. It teaches emotionally intelligent people to distrust themselves. And once an empath no longer trusts her instincts, she becomes emotionally trapped. That's why so many female empaths stay in toxic relationships longer than people understand. It's not weakness. It's psychological conditioning. Because toxic people mix affection with emotional pain, love with distance, warmth with withdrawal. And the empath becomes obsessed with restoring emotional harmony, especially because female empaths can see the wounded child inside toxic people. You see the pain beneath the behavior, the abandonment beneath the anger, the insecurity benya, the ego, and your heart keeps whispering, if I love them enough, maybe they'll heal. But here's the brutal truth most empaths learn too late. You cannot heal someone who is committed to avoiding themselves. No amount of empathy can save someone addicted to emotional escape, and eventually the empath realizes something devastating. She was never asking for too much. She was asking the wrong person. That changes everything, because once a female empath wakes up emotionally, the manipulation stops working. Now she notices patterns immediately. Now she recognizes inconsistency immediately. Now she trusts her nervous system instead of overriding it. And suddenly the same sensitivity people mocked becomes her greatest protection. That's the rebirth of the empath, not becoming colder, becoming wiser, more discerning, more protective of her peace. And maybe that's why this video found you tonight. Because deep down, you already knew. You knew something felt emotionally wrong long before. The relationship collapsed. You knew you were shrinking yourself to maintain connections built on inconsistency. You knew you kept giving people emotional access they never earned. But you stayed because your heart believed love meant endurance. Now hear this carefully. Love was never supposed to require self-abandonment. Real love does not punish emotional depth. Real love does not weaponize silence. Real love does not make you feel lonely for caring deeply. And one day, you will stop apologizing for your sensitivity. You will stop chasing emotionally unavailable people hoping your love changes them. You will stop confusing emotional chaos with passion. And for the first time in your life, you will choose yourself without guilt. That day will feel unfamiliar at first. Peace usually does for people raised inside emotional survival. But eventually, you'll realize your empathy was never the weakness. It was the warning system trying to protect you the entire time. If this video reached the part of you nobody ever understood, stay close. There are more people like you than you think, and maybe for the first time in a long time, you no longer have to carry your pain alone. Subscribe if you're healing without losing your softness. And until next time, protect your heart carefully, because people who feel deeply are rare in this world.